With the brilliance of your wisdom, O compassionate one, illuminate the darkness enclosing my mind. Enlighten my intelligence and wisdom, so that I may gain insight into the Buddha's words and the texts that explain them. So that is our objective. We are presently humbly acknowledging that there's some confusion going on that creates what we call samsara. And within that confusion, we create realms of what appears to us as solid reality. And this is where the Buddha wants to whisper to us and say, you know, you think this is so real, but it's not. This is really just the confused mind projecting an appearance of reality. And if you actually investigate, you'll see that there is nothing solid about this. And that insight that cuts through this delusion, this is what we call prajna, or wisdom. And in Jigme Lingpa's work, this is then the subject that we're presently studying. So we'll look at that. And I would say, good on you for doing it, because this is really what informs our meditation practice, whether we're practicing the teachings from the Sutrayana, such as Shamatha Vipassana, the general practice of the Mahayana, or if we're practicing Vajrayana, everything comes down to awakening this lack of delusion that is innate to us, that we call Buddha nature. So it constitutes, on one hand, to eliminate the beliefs and the assumptions that we have about reality, and also to align ourselves with and discover qualities that are innate to us, such as wisdom, strength, and compassion, and which in the Vajrayana then is what we represent in the form of the mandalas, deities, and so on. You know, whenever you come to a Buddhist temple, you always, at least in the Tibetan tradition, and I think also in others, you have outside, you have a circular image that represents the 6 realms of samsara. And that's kind of like reading your Bill of Rights. This is what actually constitutes our situation. And it's for that reason we then enter the temple. And when we go into the temple, everything that we have in the temple, what we call the 3 supports, body, speech, and mind. We have statues, we have paintings, we have that represent body. Then we have all the scriptures that represent enlightened speech. And then also we have all the, you could say, symbols of awakening, such as stupas and vajras, bells, and all these kind of symbolic implements. And it's these then that in the Vajrayana that we integrate, but we do that with the understanding that our ordinary confusion, which filters all our perceptions and everything that appears to us, and in a way then ends up being our perception of reality becomes one of self and other, and all of these according to our particular disposition, what we call karmic projections. So that's unfortunately something that goes on unless we do something about it. And that's why we would, on one hand, we'd appreciate the precious human situation that we have right now, and also generate compassion, understanding how others are stuck in this particular delusion. So now, in terms of the way that we go about this in the Buddhist teaching is that first we hear what the Buddha has to say, and then we think critically about it. We don't just say, yes, sir. The Buddha doesn't want us to do that. And the really foundation for, you could say, faith, and you could say that which really begins to take hold of us in a very deep way, is the certainty that comes from first having questioned what the Buddha said. Of course, some of us can just I believe everything the teacher says, but most of us, we live in a modern culture where we think critically about things. And that's where we could say when we investigate something and we find out, oh, it's true, actually, then we have so much confidence. But then again, sometimes we also could be just like, very often in Buddhist cultures, people just have implicit trust in the Buddhist teaching. And I always compare this to myself and my car, where I have implicit trust in everything my mechanic tells me. And my mechanic might even say, Jakob, shall I explain you the engine? And I say, that's okay. Just give me the keys. I know it works. And so also in Asian cultures, you very often have practices where people would say, oh, I don't need to understand. Don't need to understand this. I trust. I've seen my aunt is an accomplished practitioner. I want to be like her. We just know that it works. But even if we're Asian, and even if we're growing up in what used to be Buddhist cultures, then we're influenced by the modern way of thinking critically. And that's where actually even modern Asians really benefit from actually this dialectic approach of really thinking and reflecting critically of what is being said. And on the basis of that, generating the kind of faith that comes from deep trust. So anyway, presently we then are looking at the I'll just show you the overview of what we're doing here. So we've looked at various ways that the Dharma is presented, and now we're looking at the Dharma itself. And the main point really is to understand how it is that we get confused about things, how we can free ourselves, how it is that things appear to us, and where it is we get it wrong, and what the nature of things actually is. And that's what we call the two truths. The difference between how things appear and how they actually are. And the truth of the matter is we get it wrong. We get it wrong with regards to how things appear to us. We think that they actually truly do exist the way that we think they are. We attribute essence to what doesn't have essence. We attribute permanence to what doesn't have permanence. We attribute happiness to, in fact, what doesn't bring happiness. And we attribute a self to what, in fact, doesn't have a self. This is what we call the three characteristics of samsara. So anyway, in approaching this questioning, we look at varying systems and how they actually approach these two truths in terms of understanding how things on one hand appear in a particular way, and on the other hand, understanding what they actually are. So we looked at the Vaibhashika system, which is very much one, you could say, an ontological approach of looking at how do things exist objectively. And they would say, yes, things appear, and yet we can take them apart. We can smash them. I can take an object and I can smash it with a hammer, and I can see it's made up of particles. What was actually there has appeared like maybe a cup. If I analyze it, or even if I smash it with a hammer, I can see it's made up of particles. And the same with my mind. I can see that, in fact, my mind are just instant after instant after instant of awareness, consciousness, mental events. And that's where, again, we could say, so that's what appears to be a continuity of mind. In fact, it's just momentary, you could say, singular instances of conscious experience. So that's the Vaibhashika approach. The Svatantrikas, they kind of adopt the same view, but they're very interested in how the subject experiences. And that's where they say the subject projects onto phenomena. So that's why they would say relative truth, that's how we project onto objects. Absolute truth is actually the object itself, how it is without our projections. And they would say something that we imagine. The problem with what we call then the relative truth, according to them, is that it actually is it's just our imagination. It's just, you could say, they call it generally perceived phenomena. And they would say the object itself is the particular phenomena is actually without our overlay of confusion. And for them, wisdom is to have less and less, you could say, belief in our projections. Then we looked at the Chittamatra, and the Chittamatra school observes that in fact it's our mind that creates everything. It's our mind that goes into samsara. It's our mind that goes in, that can be freed again. It's constantly the mind. And it's the mind that creates reality. And they go into an analysis where they say, if we look at things, they actually don't have the reality that they attribute to it. It's our projection. And that's also what we find in modern science, in neuroscience, and in general, the understanding of perceptions are, in fact, the creation that the subject brings to the particular object. For example, when we see colors, there are no colors if we investigate, in terms of breaking down the particles and so on, but we perceive it in that way. And the same way, everything that we perceive in our world is created by the subject according to our particular disposition. That's also where you have that famous example of beings of the 6 realms that perceive a glass of water. So the beings of the hell realms, they perceive it as fire, something that scorches you, something that is painful. For the hungry ghosts, it's something that they just can't have it. It's there, but they can't have it. For humans and animals, just something we drink. And for the beings of the higher realms, it's seen as nectar. When a god tastes just a drop of water, it's like, fantastic. So anyway, that's where we say the Chittamatra system spells out how things are created by our mind. Now you go into the Madhyamaka system, and this is where we're talking about the system that really all across the board in Tibetan Buddhism is seen as being is the final word on the nature of reality. And what the Madhyamikas quite simply say is that everything is dependently arisen, hence it has no essence. Everything that appears exists on the basis of a web of causes and conditions. Now, so that's where things appear, but they don't have existence. That's common for all the Madhyamikas. But you have what's called the Svatantrika. And they actually, and this is for us in the modern world that comes with its own particular brand of science, very interesting, because they actually look at how do these appearances come about. And they actually philosophize, or they actually make analysis about what we call relative truth, appearances. So that's where they are quite helpful in terms of the modern person who would like to understand where does everything come from. And that's where they then actually do investigate this on the relative level. And that's why they're called Svatantrikas, because they actually make Svatantra means Tantra means the continuity of something, but Sva means that it then has essence, or that it has a identity. And that's where they're a little bit, the Svatantrika term really implies that they have some degree of asserting realism. They're interested, they philosophize, they analyze relative truth, but they're still Madhyamikas. They still understand that absolute truth, in reality, nothing has any inherent existence at all. So that's where the Svatantrika Madhyamaka is seen as actually being a little bit helpful for us who are, you could say, just normal persons. The Prasangikas are for those who are very gifted. They're there for the beings of superior capacities. So, for example, Chandrakirti, he's a Prasangika Madhyamaka. The teaching that we have, entering the way of what's called the introduction to the middle way, the Madhyamaka Avatara, which we have studied, it presents the view of emptiness. It presents the highest understanding, but it doesn't really actually take into account how we think in terms of our perceptions of ordinary reality. So it simply just says, whatever is dependently arisen is by nature empty. And that's that's what you have. So we're presently looking at this Svatantrika Madhyamaka, and I'll just go over the verse again from Jigme Lingpa. 134, says, all appearing things exist upon the level of the relative and are illusion-like by nature, though ultimately none is real, but is like space. To make this affirmation is the way of the Svatantrika Madhyamikas. So here we have it. All appearing things exist upon the level of the relative. And that's where they say they're illusion-like. So phenomena appear, but there's also an analysis that goes in and says, yeah, it's like illusion. There's still you could say, a thought about this. So they also understand that in being like an illusion, there's nothing real, but they're interested in what is it that generates that illusory perception. So I'll just go over what we just last time. It says, the Svatantrika Madhyamikas say that phenomena, form, things we see, and the other objects of the six senses have a natural existence of their own on the relative level. And this is established by conventional reasoning. And that's why I think I also, even though I might hope not scaring anybody, but then you have two ways of establishing this conventional reasoning. One is this Sotrantika, that we saw before, those that assert phenomena on the basis of that they actually have, there's an extra mental, there's something out there that they appreciate how things come about and how they exist. And that's where we would say these are Madhyamikas who are the Svatantrika Madhyamikas, but they analyze relative truth like Sotrantikas. Then you have the other variety of Svatantrika Madhyamikas in terms of conventional reasoning. And they use Chittamatra, or what then is called Yogacharya reasoning. And they say everything is the mind. So they would say everything is created by the subject. It is experienced on the basis of the subject. They're not saying there's nothing out there. It's not solipsism. It's still an acceptance that there is, you could say, a field, so to speak, but it's just that they would say the way that we experience things is entirely on the basis of our of our mind. So they don't assert any particles or anything as having any reality. Entirely mind that paints the whole picture. So they would say, although phenomena have no true existence, yet on their own level, meaning as the phenomena appear, they do exist. In this context, existing from their own side, existing on their own level, existing according to their characteristics, and substantially existing, are regarded as synonymous. And where these expressions refer to, and what these expressions refer to, is not considered the proper object of refutation by reasoning that establishes the absolute truth. That's then on the relative truth, you just don't bring in the absolute truth. Absolute truth is established by a reasoning that simply just when you analyze, I think we've talked about this before, when you analyze anything, the more you analyze, the less you find. It always gets more and more complex. And that's, by the way, forget about Buddhist philosophy, try this in life. Whenever you have an opinion about something, someone, try and analyze the object, and keep going deeper. And the more you'll see that something appears one way or another, the more we understand about it, the more it becomes complex. And that complexity is actually what spells out the lack of inherent existence, that phenomena really just exist on the basis of causes and conditions. Goes for people, goes for things. Anyway, in the case here of the Svatantrika Madhyamikas, we're the point really of when we're talking about things, we simply just leave them as they appear, and more about understanding the way they appear. So here then, thus for the Svatantrika, it seems that when the Madhyamika texts say that phenomena are without inherent existence, it is necessary to add that this is to be understood on the level of the absolute truth alone. So that's where the Svatantrikas, they're very at home explaining relative truth. Now, I'm going on about this quite a bit because that is really an important point. And I feel justified in doing this also because the translator here also puts in some substantial commentary about this. So our translators, they write, it seems that for the Svatantrikas, it is theoretically possible to confine oneself exclusively to the relative level and to discourse meaningfully about phenomena, the way they are and the way they function, without reference to the absolute truth. So in other words, you can have a normal discussion with a Svatantrika. Forget about the Prasangikas. They'll just sort of nod and basically agree with everything you say, but they know that it's all just delusion, which is absolutely true. But if we want to discuss something, whatever it might be, then the Svatantrikas, they're willing to actually sit down and then say, okay, well, what do we have here? So the absolute truth thus becomes a kind of overarching proviso to the effect that phenomena are completely without true existence, but this does not interfere with science and philosophy, which can continue on the relative level. So that's where the Svatantrikas, they understand relative truth, but they're still willing to sort of have some discussions about, about particle physics or medicine or just how experience takes place the way it does. And again, I would say this is quite important for the modern person because we inevitably, we do think in terms of how these appearances take place. All right, so hold on. So there is an obvious and probably indispensable pedagogical advantage in the Svatantrika approach in that it provides space in which a teaching about the nature of phenomena can be elaborated in terms accessible to the ordinary intellect, and which can thus help people to progress on the path. Now, for example, for us to understand the whole thing about enlightenment, rebirth, the law of karma, and so on, is necessary for us to have for the Prasangikas, they would just say, oh yeah, there is no rebirth, there is no karma, there is no New York City, there's no Democrats' National Convention, there is no Paris, there is no COVID, there is no individual. That's what they would say, oh yeah, well, if you say that, fine. But they don't actually ever go into any analysis about this. But for the modern person, then particularly when it comes to the Buddhist teaching, we'd like to understand how is it that actually we talk about, no self, and then people talk about rebirth. Can you please explain this to me? And to understand how relative truth has a grip on us and how we actually get caught up on the basis of everything the Abhidharma explains, which is ignorance that creates a sense of self, and the self creates a sense of object, and the subject-object duality, we fixate on it as being solid, and on the basis of that, we then have a body, we have an experience of a world, and we have an ongoing experience in terms of our projections. Everything that is essentially taught in terms of the five skandhas, in terms of the ways that consciousness plays out, the Svatantrika Madhyamikas, they're willing to talk about that. And that is very helpful. They are perfectly willing to engage in all the discussions about phenomenology, if you like. So that's where the Svatantrika, you could say, are very compassionate in the sense, or as they say here, pedagogical, because it actually explains the things that otherwise, to be told that, well, it's all just empty. You could probably sort of deduce that by analysis and so on and say, yes, that's true. but we're still stuck with the perception of things as being very real on the relative level. So that's where it's helpful to understand, how is this relative level pieced together? How is it constructed? So that's where they elaborate, present things in a pedagogical way, like it says it in a way, in terms accessible to the ordinary intellect, and which can thus help people to progress on the path. At the same time, the critique of the Prasangikas is understandable and inevitable, and that is that, yes, none of it has any reality, ultimately. So the Prasangikas also, they accept relative truth in terms of there are appearances, but they don't really go beyond that. And as such, they don't really care too much about the two truth division. For them, it's all just, any assertion in any way is refuted. So that's where we could say this critique that the Prasangikas have is understandable and inevitable. To say that phenomena have a natural existence of their own on the relative level amounts to attributing true existence to them. So that's where the Prasangikas, they would say, don't bother. But, persons like myself, I'm concerned with perceptions. And I can also see in our culture, very difficult to go anywhere unless you actually begin to address perceptions. So that's where it is, so to speak, a ratification of the relative truth as being independently valid. The two truths are divided, and their union is in practice abandoned. On the other hand, the purpose of Madhyamaka is precisely to undermine the tyranny of clinging to phenomena. It must compromise the status of phenomena radically, even on the relative level. And that's where, yes, at that point then, when the Svatantrikas, they say, okay, things are ultimately empty, but we're discussing how they appear. At that time, that can undermine our belief in solidity. The moment, for example, we are brought up to believe that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain. It's something that emerges from neurobiological systems. That's what we were brought up to. And that's where we even beginning to challenge that and begin to understand how actually our experience unfolds not on the basis of something that lacks consciousness, but on the basis of consciousness and understanding the primary role of consciousness. And that's where we then begin to see that our attribution to a solid material reality is very questionable. But if we just go straight to the Prasangika, then that won't be, then we might have some idea about emptiness, but we still think everything is just like our science teacher told us. So that's where we don't really, it is very helpful to then have this Svatantrika approach. So phenomena appear like illusions according to the interdependence of causes and conditions. They are really there, existing according to characteristics. So, we perceive something is blue. Yeah, it's definitely blue. We got a blue car. If we ordered a red car and we get a blue car, we'll definitely feel that then the salesperson could say, yeah, but it's just your perception. If you analyze the actual molecular level of the red and the blue, you won't find it. And that's where you might disagree with the salesperson and say, no, I want that blue car that I ordered. So that's where we have a very clear sense of really there, existing according to characteristics, right? It is thus possible to discourse about distinct phenomena, actions, and their effects. So that's also where we can talk about rebirth. We can talk about past and future lives and the effects of actions, karma, the six realms, and so on. On the other hand, if the ontological status of these phenomena is examined using analysis and reasoning on the absolute level, they are found to be devoid of any kind of existence. And that's where you might have gotten the red car and complaining about it. But actually, if you really analyze, then the distinction, red, blue, and in fact, even the notion of car, even the notion of somebody who wanted something else, and the notion of self is entirely dismantled. And that we can't ignore that. That's absolutely essential. And the whole Buddhist path is premised on the willingness to actually look that deep into the nature of reality. Not to become a smart person, but just to go beyond suffering, the causes of suffering, which is this attribution of solidity. And that needs to be undermined. So that's where then, in that sense, the ontological of phenomena is then established as they say here, utterly pure, empty like space. In this context, the expression true existence, absolute existence, actual reality, and ultimate existence are all synonyms and are equally the object of refutation by analysis at the absolute level. So that's where, on the basis of analysis, we refute. There is nothing ultimately existing. It's just appearances, has no reality. The Svatantrikas state that the objects of refutation are specifically the self of phenomena and the personal self. These are the general tenets of the Svatantrika Madhyamika. So this Svatantrika, yes, they, as much as they're willing to talk about relative truth, they never forget that the ultimate nature of phenomena is empty, like space. And so that's where they, on that level, then they also, just like all the other Buddhist vehicles, they refute this notion that we attribute solidity to phenomena. And that solidity that we attribute to phenomena, we call the self of phenomena, and also the notion of personal self. So these are then the general tenets of the Svatantrika. And again, I think this is important, and that's also why in the last 100 years, particularly in the Nyingma tradition, there's been a lot of appreciation for this approach. And that's where Jamyang Khyentse Wangpo, he asked Mipham Rinpoche to please clarify these teachings of the sutra teachings of the Nyingma. And we have a translation of the commentary that Mipham Rinpoche wrote, called The Adornment of the Middle Way, to the teaching from the great Abbot Shantarakshita, who was one of the three founding fathers of the Nyingma tradition, together with King Tristan Detsen and Padmasambhava. So that teaching comes from the Svatantrika Madhyamika tradition, and is again a teaching that Mipham Rinpoche sort of, you say, brought forth, and is very prominent in the Nyingma tradition, and also very, very helpful in understanding the Vajrayana and the logic of the Vajrayana. Okay. Hey, shall we just see if there's anybody who has any questions? Yes, I think there's one question. So, in terms of the description of how the perception of the relative level is pieced together, how is it pieced together? What is a good place to start looking at that particular question, other than investigating on our own experience, but a book or series of learnings that direct how to conduct that investigation? Actually, the tenet systems themselves, they really afford a very, you could say, progressive, gradual introduction that takes to emptiness, that takes us through the various ways that we can understand relative truth. They're obviously objects of refutation, but it's very helpful for us, for example, to first look at how the Vibhashikas, they take apart phenomena, because that enables us to have a fresh look at the relative truth, right? I mean, even your physics teacher could have done that. But here also they look at consciousness. You know, even the moment that we begin to understand that our consciousness is not an ongoing, I have this, you know, like for example, when we have things that really are a big deal for us. Something happened for us, you know, somebody did something unjust or hurt us or whatever. We hold on to it as being, you know, that there's something really there. And for us to actually begin to understand that these moments, these present moments of experience, they actually are just created moment by moment and really only have the reality that we give them on the basis of holding one moment to the next moment. And what we can observe is that they can be broken anytime. You know, we can be deep in an emotional state, and then somebody calls us up and it immediately shifts. You know, somebody distracts us. So we can see that mind is continually just singular moments. Already there, we begin to have a shift. And then the Svatantrikas that highlight how we project, and how our projection doesn't necessarily correspond to the object. That also most of us are humbly aware of. Then beginning to look at how it's how reality is constructed. So what I'm saying here is the tenet systems, and I put up a paper, very brief, something I wrote, but I'd also like to recommend Khenpo Tsultring Gyatso's a text called
How do we spell the name? Sorry, Jakob.
yeah.
You mentioned Kenpo. I didn't understand how to spell the name that you said.
Yeah, let me just write it down. Khenpo Tsultring Gyatso. I'll just write it for you here. And he wrote and also I actually, some years ago, I went over this. The recording is somewhere if you're interested. Stages on the meditation of emptiness, I think it's called. And you know, that's where he particularly he really goes into how this applies to meditation. I mean, it's not just we're talking philosophy, because I can tell you, you can get some works that are. There's a book by someone called Daniel Kozon, which is called Buddhist Tenets of Philosophy or something like that, and it's very academic and very dry for most of us. Of course, if you can handle that and you are a practitioner, then of course it all clicks beautifully into place. But certainly, I think for most of us, to have it a little bit lined up in not too complicated manner is helpful. So this book I found really, really useful.
And what was the book stages on the
Gradual. Oh, hold on. I've written it out, but I haven't posted.
Okay.
There you go. Something
yes.
like that. Progressive. Sorry, it's called progressive stages. Yeah. For the Vibhashika, does the atom correspond to the self of phenomena? Yes. So rather, not so much, no, well, yeah, but the thing is, the atom is what is understood as the truth about phenomena. And that's where what the Vibhashika understand is relative truth is that I think that this is my clock because my watch has now stopped. So anyway, this clock is obviously there functioning. So that's what you can call relative truth. It appears. Everything that we have like that. But the physics teacher, your physics teacher, and the Vibhashika will say, yes, it's relatively a clock, but you know, ultimately, it is just atoms. So the atoms is what is found when we analyze phenomena. But that's where they would say that there's still a subtle particle that exists, and that's why we call them substantialists. We would still say that there is a particle that's indestructible.
How are they saying that particle? Sorry to jump in. Sorry. How are they saying that arises?
They would say that it's always there. Yeah, don't we have some physical law that would say, no matter is never wasted. So there's always some matter, that's around.
The God particle is the Large Hadron Collider is trying to find us.
All that, yeah.
Thank
Now
you.
for the Sautrantika, so the question continues. For the Sautrantika, specifically characterized objects correspond to the self of phenomena. Yes, that's right. So that's where, again, that's with phenomena are analyzed, then you find specifically characterized, then you find specifically characterized phenomena. So that's what, when we look at the phenomena in the Vibhashika tradition, then we're interested in how it actually exists, you could say materially or objectively. When the Sautrantikas look at phenomena, they're interested in how subjectively we are projecting onto it. And they would say the specifically characterized phenomena is that which is there beyond our projections. So they don't actually, they still operate with the same notions of that there is something material there. But they're very interested in how we construct our experience on the basis of projection and live in a realm of projection.
But still, can you hear me, Jakob?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand if this ultimate truth and ultimately true and self eventually correspond, because if that is the case, now a specifically characterized object is not permanent in the sense that it is changing.
Yeah.
No matter how specifically characterized by a prime direct cognition, but so the self is defined as something that it's beyond the change.
That's right. Well, they find out that that the phenomena that we have are impermanent, changing, and they're not unitary. And that's the nature of specifically characterized objects.
Yeah. So they
But
accept the self as change. Yeah.
Yeah, but the thing is
okay.
that when we operate with what we call the relative or the generally characterized phenomena, that is where we attribute something that is solid, unitary, and permanent.
Okay.
So for them, this discovery beyond what we project is then approaching absolute truth.
Right, it's beyond confusion. Yeah,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
thank you.
Okay, I'm going to hit you with something. This is something that we very often hear in the teachings. We see that there's a indestructible particle, right? And that's where you can't blame anybody who would say that. Here there is an indestructible particle, right? That's a building block of phenomena. So that's where the materialist scientists, they wish to keep finding something that is indestructible. Now Vasubandhu, he made a point. He said any moment that you would have something that is an indestructible particle that can't be divided further, it stands in relationship. And that's why if you have, let's here at the center, you have something that we would call the indivisible ultimate particle, which is what atom means. It still stands in relation to the particles around it, whatever we might call them, whether we call them, what is the things that float around in the atomic theory. It still stands in relationship to something, and as such, then the center indestructible particle still stands in a relationship. It is not indestructible. It is, or rather, it's not indivisible. It's not ultimate. And so any given phenomena, and we can keep going down, we can divide that into, again, further, but we'll have the same situation happen again. It still stands in relationship. And that is what creates appearances. So the point is, the appearances that we have, they are created on the basis of causes and conditions. They're created on the basis of a set of phenomena that come together as we have it here. So they're not, the point is not to deny that there's an appearance. It's just to understand that the appearance doesn't have essence. What we do when we operate in the world is that we attribute essence to the phenomena. And it's on the basis of attributing essence to phenomena that we then have likes and dislikes. For example, and that's where we fail. When we have an appearance, we fail to see that it's that it's not essential, it's not monolithic, it's not unchanging. For example, if we look at a window and we say, oh, the window is dirty, then we actually know that the window is not dirty. It's just on the basis of the appearance of a dirty window. What we really have is something that can be removed, namely the grime and the dust. And so when we understand that things are not essential, then we understand that they are created by causes and conditions. We can do something about it. It's an enormously empowering perspective. So I see a dirty window and I think, oh, well, you know, I'm just going to clean it. I feel that because of understanding that it's not essentially stuck in being dirty, I can clean it. And that is where you can say the Buddhas also, they'll look at any sentient being and say, well, they're in a one particular way, but that's really just appearance, and that their confusion is removable. Similarly, also, if there's somebody that we care about or we love, and we see that they're stuck in a really destructive pattern, then we'd like to say, hey, you're not a bad person. You're just stuck in a particular pattern of believing in a solidity. And that really goes for every given phenomenon that we have, that all that we have are just appearances that are continually, if you like, in flux. Why this is more than just being impermanent, it is really to understand that there is no essence behind it, right? Even when they are fully functioning and you could say operative, you know, that phenomena are from the very start nothing but appearances. So that's also why the Buddha says, you know, this emptiness is not other than the appearances. Form is not other than emptiness. Emptiness is not other than form. But the logic of this one here is really to say that any given, if we were to go down to the most subtle particle, it would still be just part of something that stands in relation and is not indivisible. So that's where everything that we have in the universe is like that. It really just is part of, it only really exists in relationship. It really just attains its reality on the basis of its relationship with others. Vasubandhu says, if it was that this thing here, if there really was a unitary particle, if this was unitary, that would mean that these here, they would also be part of that singular particle. And that would mean that all phenomena would be just one big thing, one big lump. But we can see that's not the case. Everything exists on the basis of standing in relationship. And so it doesn't really mean that phenomena go away. It really just, the problem that we have lies in our personal subjective attribution of essence to phenomena that don't have essence. Does that make sense?
That was awesome. That was such a great explanation. Thank you.
You often have, actually in this book, they refer to Khenpo Kunsang Palden's explanation on the Chittamatra. And in there you have this quote from Vasubandhu. So it's something that comes up quite often. But yes, so phenomena in themselves, they are empty. You could say the nature of our reality is empty. The problem is that we are the ones who are, you could say, projecting onto them. So that's what we're dealing with here, with everything that we're doing with cultivating wisdom. It's really just that we're addressing this habit we have of attributing solidity, you know?
Jakob, may I put a question?
Please.
I am a phenomenon as well. So I'm an illusion as well.
Yes.
But yeah, but I think I perceive, and I do perceive, but in the end, I'm not existing. So that's for me a problem. I mean, I know that I could be just awareness, theoretically. But discussing all this, all the different philosophies, it's always me and my mind, my
Yes, and also
yeah.
the room that you're sitting in, you know, the bookshelf behind you, and so
Yes,
on.
but where is this I, this me coming from? And I mean, I know that everything is illusion, so I have to say, I myself, I am illusion.
Right. But
Yeah,
what if somebody comes and steals your money? Will you then say, I'm an illusion?
of course not. No, but what is the I? I want to know if we say everything is illusion and
Yes.
all the phenomena have no inherent self.
Yes.
That's okay. I have no inherent self, but my mind
Yes.
is there. Where is
That's
my mind coming from? And
so right. So we can say everything is an illusion, or everything is dependently arisen. Everything is a web of causes and conditions. And for example, like you would probably agree, you're a body and also a mind. So there's this multiplicity in my body. There's a multiplicity in my mind. And yet I attribute self to my mind, which my mind is always changing, right? And also my body is always changing. You know, in biology, we're told every 7 years, our body is completely replaced. Now, so you ask, why is it then that we attribute self to what clearly is not a self? And that's where we then see, that is what we call in the Buddhist teaching, the first link of dependent arising, ignorance. And that's that moment where this ignorance takes place. We begin to think I, and then we also begin to think object.
where is ignorance coming from?
Simply just a failure to be aware. You know, if you come across teachings like in the Great Perfection or Mahamudra, or even in Vedanta, you will say everything is awareness. All the time, what the Buddha and all the sages are trying to say is try to be aware, because in that space of awareness, we don't fall into that delusion.
And suddenly ignorance arises. Why?
Because now we've been habituated for such a long time. I have been so habituated to my lack of awareness, my unconsciousness for such a long time that it's my second nature. I attribute solidity to this. And
But
that's
where is I coming from? It's a vicious circle somehow.
it's the awareness that simply fails to understand itself.
The awareness fails to understand itself.
Yes. For example.
Aha. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a very important sentence.
That's the essence of it. You know, we would say really that the samsara has never actually come into existence. It's just because there is this moment of blackout. You know, Marlene, sometimes if you practice meditation, you'll say, okay, now I'm going to remain undistracted. You know, I'm going to remain present. I'm going to come back to my breath, or I'm going to focus on the object of concentration. And then you find yourself all of a sudden thinking about, you know, somebody that you were talking with. Now, at that moment, when this unawareness took place, it wasn't that you said, oh, now unawareness is going to come. It just took all of a sudden we're distracted. All of a sudden, we're distracted. Also, you know, for example, when you fall asleep at night, you know, sometimes we can't fall asleep. We lie there, you know, when am I going to fall asleep? When am I going to fall asleep? And then all of a sudden, we're asleep. We're lost. We're present, and then we're lost. So that happens all the time in our, you could say, moment-to-moment experience, that we can be aware, be mindful, and then all of a sudden we're completely distracted.
Yes, but even if I can be aware, totally aware, pure awareness, I mean, that's theoretical now. But then there is still the I, which is the awareness. And there
Yes.
should be awareness without I.
Yes. What happens is that this, once the, you know, once this awareness that is lost, and we then have a sense of I, and then we're just operating from the sense of, oh, I have to do this,
Yes.
me and the object, it can become very toxic. And then it can become the kleshas. It can become very strong sense of I. Let's say somebody insults me, then I get really angry, and I have a strong sense of me and that other stupid person.
For
And so
sure.
that
But for me,
that becomes more and more solid, ingrained, the sense of I.
That's for sure. But the beginning, the very beginning of the I, because when I, for example, pray, I want to join my mind stream with the mind stream of my guru.
Yes. Yeah.
So that means there is my mind
Yes.
stream.
Yes.
There, my I, my awareness.
Yes. Yes.
But I want to dissolve it.
Yes. And that's where, in the practice of meditation, when there, for example, is a strong devotion, and there's really just the melting away of even the sense of I want to be one with you. There's simply just the devotion. So that's on the, now you're giving the example of praying to the teacher. And that's where we would always understand the teacher is not external. The teacher ultimately is within, but the devotion to the teacher and that sense of bhakti or adoration or respect actually creates a space in which the grip of the self becomes less and less. So it's not as if all of a sudden there's going to be no self, but we can see how selflessness can become bigger and bigger. You know, when you, for example, have a calm day, then you're very relaxed, very open, then the self becomes more and more, you could say, accommodating. Whereas when it becomes small and angry, then it's very tight. So we can see self, the delusion of self is very flexible. So when we're practicing, whatever we do, whether it's compassion or devotion or mindfulness, it actually relaxes this sense of self, and it becomes less and less and less, has less and less a grip on us. So when we do philosophy, then we understand there is no self. We can't find it. But when we do practice, that's where we integrate that vision in relaxing the grip on the self through whatever practice it is that we do. And that's where the self becomes more and more open. There's still a sense of self. That will happen up until the 9th Bhumi. The 9th Bhumi Bodhisattva still has a subtle sense of,
okay,
I'm practicing. It's only at the level of complete awakening that any reference point falls away. But you can see at the present moment, big difference between uptight little self and expansive, relaxed self. So that's where the self is in process. And it's flexible. And that's where, when we talk about Buddha nature, it's like we say there's the window, and we say it's a dirty window. But we know that, in fact, it's really just on the basis of beginning to clean the window that we discover there's more, it becomes more and more clear. And so when we are practicing, even though there is a self, the clinging to the self becomes less and less. So that's where we have a big difference between when we do analysis or philosophy and when we meditate. So that's why we could be very frustrated as philosophers, because we think, oh, there is no self, but yet I have a self. That's the philosopher. But for the meditator, then it's very clear that when we've been sitting and meditating, we just let the thoughts go, or if we do shamatha, or if we do shamatha vipassana, we let the thoughts go, becomes less and less and less tight. We get less and less fascinated by our thinking. Or if we're Vajrayana practitioners, you could say bhakti yogins, then we have devotion to the teacher. Also there, the self becomes less and less and less.
Yeah, but the self, sorry, I don't want to bore the others.
No, this is a good one. This is important.
Um,
Matt is giving it the thumbs up.
Self-dissolving of self is okay, but my mind continues.
That's the nature of, you could say, reality. We're not going to stop the mind unless we take drugs or have a lobotomy. The nature of our consciousness is that it's luminous. So what we mean with the mind is luminous means that it's always capable of imagining. You know, I can say I don't know, these Eiffel Tower, and you have in your mind Eiffel Tower. The mind has the ability. The mind is always, you know, reflecting. It has the nature of continually being engaged in objects and thinking. And that's why when we practice shamatha, those thoughts arise, but we bring our attention back to the object of what we're meditating on. That's where we can have thoughts, but we don't need to follow after them. We're never going to stop thoughts. You know, when in the Buddhist teaching, they talk about the samadhi of non-thought. That doesn't mean that we don't have thoughts, but it means that we're not entangled in the thoughts. So that's why the foundation of meditation is really this capacity, or rather the practice of just being focused without being distracted. And that we train ourselves in.
But you talk about we, and that means our mind. We.
Yes. Yeah.
And you say, just to repeat, you say this mind can't be dissolved until the ninth bhumi.
No, the self, the notion of self. But the mind still has, you could say, the nature of our reality, both outside and inside, is what we call luminous. So we would say at the level of perfect enlightenment, there the Buddha nature appears as wisdom and as kayas. And that's why we would say there's the entire display that is for the benefit of sentient beings. So right now you can say we're filtered through ignorance. And so we create samsara. At the level of enlightenment, that you could say phenomena that is being diminished and filtered arises as the compassionate display and the qualities of awakening.
Thank you.
Can I also just offer, I find language is so powerful, like in going, looking at the five aggregates subject to clinging, there is the feeling arises, but then saying, I am feeling pain is additional to, rather than pain is being felt. The linguistic construction of the solidity of self, I find particularly imprisoning, or really helpful as a doorway out, because our language is constantly re-solidifying the sense of self, whereas it doesn't totally accurately describe the immediacy of the experience. Memory is being known, or hand, or whatever it is. So that has been something that I've just observed is, and obviously through the teachings, but how language contributes, because the I, you can't find it, but yet it is one of the most used words in our language. It is the only way that we describe experience. So there's a tension between reality and our linguistic, and what is useful linguistically, because you still have to go, I want to go to France. So I found that to be an area that has loosened the grip somewhat just by noticing it. So that is what I wanted to say.
Thank you. But I would say I appreciate very much this discussion, because it's some, you know, I know from from myself and from many of my friends that these are really things that very often are left not exactly clarified. And actually, we would want to clarify it at the level of, you could say, right now, what we're doing here is establishing a theoretical understanding that will enable us to be quite clear on what we're doing when we're meditating. So that's where what we call establishing the view is so important before, or you could say basic to, the practice. And that's also where practicing without the view very often leaves us with a lot of doubts. I mean, we might be doing some practice that we've been told to do, but we're sort of like, it's still things that are not quite clear. So that's where it's very helpful to bring up this discussion. So thank you for doing that. Please don't feel shy. It's completely appropriate for the present circumstances. What I'll do actually is also what I'll upload in the room here is a chapter from Chogyam Trungpa's Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism, and it's called The Development of Ego. And Marlene was asking, how does the self come about? And actually, Trungpa Rinpoche, he gives some very good explanation of how it is that we begin to conceive of a self. So that might be useful. I'll upload that in the resources folder. Okay. Thank you very much. Yeah.
So I put a link in the message, Marlene. I've listened to that particular episode about 50 times, and it never gets old. It's a really wonderful a journey through the 12 links of dependent origination, going the way back, why the Buddha arrived at and looked at the conditioning, what conditions, what, and Joseph Goldstein cycles back through it and then through once again, and then looks at how the links with respect to ignorance, conditioning, tanha, conditioning, wisdom, as opposed to ignorance, conditioning, tanha, conditioning, grasping, and becoming, and looks at how the experience of I can be like, how you can get in and like cut in the mechanics of how it arises. So I'm not an expert, but I have found that very, very helpful. And I've listened over and over and over again, and it has really helped understanding the experience.
So is that's something that you're putting a link to down here in the chat?
It's in the message chat.
Okay, cool. All right.
It's on, but it's on YouTube as well. And it was, he goes back and through in like 25, 30 minutes. And I'm like, holy moly, like that. He's really motoring, he covers ground. It's great. It's very, very helpful. Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Matt. And it is really these 12 links. They are important for us for understanding what we're doing. Yeah. So that's really good. Thanks. So combine that with the thing that I'll upload. So okay, we'll conclude with some dedication here. Let's see here. Through all our births, wherever we may be born, may we be endowed with the 7 good qualities of the higher realms. As soon as we're born, may we meet with the Dharma and have the freedom to practice it properly. At that time, may we please the holy gurus and practice the Dharma throughout the day and night. Realizing the Dharma and accomplishing its essential meaning, may we cross the ocean of existence in that life. Thoroughly teaching the holy Dharma in this world, may we never tire of accomplishing the benefit of others. By this vast benefit of others, without partiality or bias, may all attain Buddhahood together. Thank you.